is that New York City was the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. We think of New York City and Brooklyn as great, pluralistic, democratic, politically progressive places today. And quite rightly, I think those of us who believe in social justice celebrate that. Unfortunately, the city itself, as well as Brooklyn to some extent, harbor a much more difficult past. And the pluralistic, progressive democracy that we all appreciate in New York City, in Manhattan, and Brooklyn today was built on a past that is much more troubling. And I think that's, as I say in the book, a reflection of the country more generally, right? Because we have a tendency sometimes in our civil religion, as we sometimes call it, in America, to celebrate our founding documents and to celebrate the story of freedom that is part of American history. But what I think we're reminded of when we look at New York and when we think about America generally in the 19th century, we realize that the stories of the making of New York City and the making of the nation are as much about the denial of freedom as they are about freedom itself. So in New York specifically, what happens is that the city becomes so beholden to its cotton trade with the southern states. And all of those bales of cotton, which you know so well, Roshana, having written on New Orleans, that are funneled into the great ports of the South. Those tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton grown by and harvested by Black people have to make their way ultimately to textile factories so that they can be turned into finished products, right? So that they can be turned into fine linens and dresses and curtains. And so how is that facilitated? How do these bales of raw cotton make their way to the cotton mills of New England, or for that matter, the cotton textile mills of places like Manchester and Liverpool in the UK? Well, that is all facilitated by New York financiers, by, New York bankers, by New York merchants. It is insured by New York insurance companies. And the ships are in large part outfitted by New York firms. So New York, particularly Wall Street, knows exactly where its wealth is coming from. Now, it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about Wall Street, in the 1820s and 30s. It's not much of it's certainly not the Wall Street entity, the monolithic sort of iconic thing that it is today. But
down there was all swamp at one time.
Oh, and they did it sort of like New Orleans, put trash there to build on top of the trash.
They built on top of that in order to build that business area.
Okay.
But that was Africans and Jews were not allowed to be buried in New York proper. So they had to be buried down there. That's why that's an African burial ground. Was because blacks and Jews were not allowed to be buried in the city unless they owned the property, which is Senegal Village, which is in Central Park. The largest plantation in America during the 13 colonies was in Brooklyn.
Really?
Yeah. And also, Battery Park.
Yes.
Okay, that's where the docks used to be, where they would bring the Africans. And they would march them across to the other side of New York, which would be Wall Street, where they would be sold in Wall Street. When you're dealing with stocks and bonds, the thing is that Africans were considered to be chattel because they also sold cattle. They sold a lot of things, but they sold black folk. Mm-hmm. And so basically, stocks and bonds comes from livestock in bondage.
Wow.
See, it's right in front of us, but it's just that unless you zero in on the conversation, you miss certain important points to understand.
It's veiled. It's really veiled.
And also, because they brought so many Africans over, many times they could not house everybody in Wall Street because, there's prisons under the Stock Exchange building.
No.
Yeah. The movie by Bruce Willis shows it, Die Hard. There's a scene in one of those movies where he's underneath the Stock Exchange, where you see the real prisons. That's where they used to keep the Africans before they brought them up to sell them. But there were some Africans that they brought so many over at one time that they literally just had to drop them off into little prisons along the street from Battery Park going over to Wall Street. Mm. So today, guess what that street's called? Chambers Street.
Ah, yes.
So that's where they used to put, those were little prisons at one time, where they held Africans. And then when it was time to sell them, they would take them across Chambers Street into Wall Street on the Stock Exchange and sell them.
So at the actual Stock Exchange, they used to trade slaves there?
Yes. They sold them.
Sold slaves there?
Yeah. That was the first stock exchange. It was livestock or black folk because they considered black folk like chattel. So they were like livestock. Black folk built Broadway and Broad Street. They also built that's the Bowery.
It is true to say that Wall Street is a symbol for the city's prosperity in this period and very consciously labels itself that way. So the city makes tremendous profits. And I think in large part, it's safe to say that the city's growing prosperity, it's growing numbers of, in terms of population, it's growing power in the world, is in no small measure based upon its trade with the Cotton South. And that makes it very protective of its interests, very protective of Southern slavery, very protective of the Union, because the Union, the constitutional compact, is what, that's the umbrella under which this prosperity is made possible. So we could talk also about the Fugitive Slave Clause just for a second, which is part of the Constitution of the United States. And when I say the nation is as much about the denial of freedom as it is about freedom itself, the Constitution is a prime example of that. The Fugitive Slave Clause mandated that if an enslaved person was somehow able, at great personal risk, to make it into a precarious freedom in New York or Boston or Detroit, that it didn't mean that that person was free, that in fact, those communities, those northern states were required by constitutional law to return runaways. It just so happens, that the prosperity on which Wall Street is basing its emergence and the power of New York City itself was not only deeply racist, but dovetailed quite nicely with its attachment to, protecting the Union and the prosperity that it fostered. New York City was a port in the transatlantic slave trade half a century after it had been rendered illegal. Congress does outlaw the nation's participation in the transatlantic slave trade in the early part of the 1800s, but by no means does that eliminate the country's prominent role in the transatlantic slave trade. So we talked about children being abducted from classrooms. We've alluded perhaps to people being snatched away from the alleyways in the cities of Lower Manhattan and from Brooklyn. But a story equally difficult to appreciate is the fact that all along the Battery, all along the ports, the docks and the wharves of the East River and the Hudson River were ships that sailed in and out of the incredibly busy docks. And it was just too easy for people to outfit ships for the slave trade, and even for that matter, to bring enslaved people surreptitiously into New York and into Brooklyn as part of that trade. So Cuba, Africa, New York City, they were all linked in complicated ways that we're only beginning to really fully understand. The Portuguese company that you mentioned was a name that was sort of offhandedly given to a group of Portuguese diplomats and traders in Madeira wine and other forms of legitimate trade, who more or less used that as a cover to outfit ships for the slave trade. The level of thievery from Black wealth, the level of cheapening Black lives, the literal kidnapping of Black people who may or may not have been born free and taking them into bondage in the South, all of that tells me that there is absolutely a case that is completely warranted for some form of reparations. The other side of your question, in terms of sort of modern policing, I mean, that's another thing that I tried to cover in some op-eds that I did leading up to the book's publication in Time Magazine, Smithsonian, and those of you who are interested can look those up. But in short, the story, unfortunately, is all too familiar. The stories of stop and frisk, the killing of people like George Floyd and Eric Gardner and Breonna Taylor, and the modern horror stories that we've experienced this year especially, but also, particularly in recent history, is so clearly reflected in the ways in which Black people were made vulnerable by the kidnapping club. And the problem is that the police, of course, have always been an extension of the public, right, and the public will. And, for politicians who prey on, in demagogic ways, on fears of, criminality, are glossing over the fact that Black people are the ones who have been victims of white criminality throughout much of American history at the hands of legal and political authorities as well as individual citizens. So I think there are a lot of parallels that can be made today. And I do think that the case for reparations is pretty clear in my mind. New York City is kind of out front in the sense of being so strongly pro-South and pro-slavery. But yes, absolutely, all across the antebellum North, from San Francisco to Boston, there are communities within those cities who think it's absurd that we would begin to question the constitutional compromise between North and South and risk the great American experiment in Republican government, or risk the growing power and wealth of the country just to protect the civil rights of some black people. They thought that was insane. Their opinion was, if we let black people run free and never claimed anybody as a runaway and never abided by the constitutional compromise in the Fugitive Slave Clause or the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the white South would leave. They would form their own government. The Union would be no more, and the umbrella under which all of our prosperity that we've enjoyed would collapse. So, there's a political calculation, a rationale that they're making. And mostly this is, in fact, a very democratic city before the Civil War. New York City votes against Lincoln in 1860 by overwhelming numbers. I think somebody asked about self-emancipated. That's just sort of a word. It's actually, not a modern word. It actually was used in the mid-19th century. But self-emancipated just is a word that gives agency to people who ran away. In other words, instead of calling them runaways or fugitives, saying that they were self-emancipated, gives them the agency that they're due, which is they're the ones who took on the risk.
For centuries, New York City was built on the backs of slaves.
The New York City slave market was a wooden structure with a roof and open sides. It had an auction block and room for maybe 30 men. And from 1711 to 1762, it trafficked thousands of slaves, men and women, shiploads of children, even captured Indians. But Africans who passed through the slave market helped build the wealth of some very famous companies that are still around. Aetna, New York Life, J.P. Morgan Chase. Various units of these and other financial companies either bankrolled southern plantations or insured slaves as property, or both. A sign that anyone can read that in the 1700s, New York had an official location for buying, selling, and renting human beings. Moore says the first cargo of 11 Africans comes by ship in 1626, in the earliest days of New Amsterdam.
Slavery arrives at the same time as the free Europeans do.
By the year 1700, New York has 5,000 people. At least 750 of them are slaves.
So you start to see more and more Africans arriving here.
Many are sold and taken elsewhere, but some stay and do the heavy work of creating Lower Manhattan, building the port,
widening the Native American trails and creating roads like Broadway.
African men also farm and clear land. They build houses and bridges and docks. African women take care of children and do household chores. In 1700, 40% of families in New York City own at least one slave. And it's also a common thing to send slaves into the street to hire themselves out.
Slave owners made additional profits by short-term and even long-term rental of their enslaved property.
But the city fathers are hearing complaints from their fellow white colonials about all the African laborers walking around and mingling with each other, which some fear could lead to a slave rebellion. So the Common Council, an early version of our city council, brings order to the business.
In 1711, a wooden pier is set up at the corner of Wall Street and the East River, and that's the slave market. That becomes the acknowledged New York City market.
A crowd has gathered at the market because an agent of the ship has been walking the streets, calling out a description of his goods.
20 negars, fresh from Angola, from Guinea, from the West Indies.
You might say
4 likely wenches, 15 to 20. Cabin boys available.
Slaves are considered merchandise, so buyers can just inspect them.
some of the male slaves are being asked to flex in various ways to show how sturdy they are. The females are being touched in private places. So it's an ugly experience.
We don't like to think that the wealth of our city is built on slavery. Just that Africans built the infrastructure of the city, but New York City was a major stop on the transport of sugar and cotton. So New York bankers and New York merchants are making money on the transport and the sale of slave-produced commodities.
Other New Yorkers turn those commodities into products, like sugar for tea.
Right across the East River is the old Domino sugar plant. That's where the sugar cane and the molasses produced by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean was refined.
By the 1800s, New York City is as important as Charleston, South Carolina, to the triangular trade, which sends slaves and the goods they produce in a constant flow around the Atlantic Ocean, from England to Africa to North America.
The owner of that Domino plant at the time was a man by the name of William Havemeyer. He became the mayor of New York City.
The next mayor is Fernando Wood, who's in office during the build-up to the Civil War. Wood believes emancipation will be bad for business, so he and his allies support avoiding war with the South.
They want Lincoln to compromise because New York City bankers and merchants are so tied in with slavery, cotton, and sugar.
Wood even proposes that New York City secede from the Union.
What's interesting is that this was common knowledge to an educated New Yorker in 1890, but today it's been totally erased from our history.
The city's deep ties to the slave trade only end when slavery is abolished after the Civil War. By then, the Wall Street slave market is long gone, removed for the same reason that a lot of stuff gets torn down in New York. It was blocking a nice view of the river and bringing down real estate values.